Hi folks, you were Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this presentation. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the wider issues about will a metaphorical Julius Caesar arise or come to the fore, given the aggressive globalist deep state destruction of Western democracy, Western institutions, and Western society. We need to sort of, I guess, accept that the globalist project, which is ideological, has no room or space for democracy, or certainly no meaningful democracy, where the people voting or people vote to decide their government. That's out. That's pretty much gone everywhere. You know, we only need to look at the United Kingdom to see that every government, regional and national, is just a globalist puppet that's doing the bidding of their globalist masters. And the same, of course, in the current White House in the United States, and indeed other governments around the world, in Australia. And they're all doing the same thing, ramping up the mass migration, aggressively trying to shut down alternative points of view. Anybody who questions the globalist project, which is an ideological imposition, anyone that questions it is being dismissed as a far-right Nazi, if not Hitler personally, all this sort of stuff. So now, in order to achieve and to impose the globalist project, all the Western institutions have been undermined, if not eradicated, but certainly undermined, neutralised, and turned into just propaganda delivery systems to facilitate and enable and grease the wheels for the globalist project. Now, what this has a sort of a number of peripheral effects. The West was generally a very high trust. So the Western societies are very high trust. They've now become or been transformed into low trust societies. Done with, and it's credible to see. Having witnessed it and having been a business traveller, travelling around all the countries of the world many times over, I got to see the stark contrast between high trust and low trust countries. And I see now that Australia, indeed the rest of the West, the social trust levels. When I say social trust, I'm talking about trust in society, its structure, the values of society, trust in the government, trust in the institutions, trust in the media, trust in the courts, and so on. This is all pretty much evaporated, and it's hard to believe that it was achieved in a relatively short space of time. You think something like that would take longer, but given the very broad, all-encompassing assault on Western society that the globalists have engaged in, then I guess it's not that surprising. But through this and through the confusion and the street anarchy that goes on in, for example, a lot of American cities, but a lot of Western cities generally, the street anarchy and what seemed to be the breakdown of society in many ways, certainly the breakdown of law and order and two-tier, if not three-tier policing. So someone goes outside an abortion clinic and prays for the unborn children to survive, then they might get an FBI raid, a SWAT team, for goodness sakes. But if you parade around waving placards saying death to America and death to the West and this sort of thing, then the police aren't interested and they won't touch you. They're only interested if white people, white Christians, white people, especially white males, get together and find common cause, and then that's it. That's when the globalist deep state feels threatened and where they act viciously to crush it. So, given these sort of goings on, there's often comments, and I saw a video from Black Pigeon. If you don't know his channel, by the way, it's worth a look. Black Pigeon Speaks, Navy hater. It's certainly worth a look. He does some interesting work. Now, this idea that the West is now ready for a metaphorical Julius Caesar to come along and sort it all out, either for two reasons. One is things are so bad, people want a strong man to fix it, or two, the institutions have been so sort of crushed and pushed down that it's cleared the way for really an anything goes type solution, which could come from a metaphorical Julius Caesar type character. Now we need to just compare. I don't think the comparison with Rome, I mean, again, in a wider sort of esoteric, abstract, metaphorical sense, you throw the Caesar thing around, but I don't think enough of the similarities, some do, but not enough of the similarities exist between Rome at that time and indeed the West today. But let's just go back and do a quick history lesson of where Rome was at the time. Rome hadn't been under direct military threat for more than 100 years, and that changes people's attitudes. The land reform attempts in ancient Rome and indeed around the Italian satellites, if you like, the land reforms hadn't really gone so well. Land was being split up into smaller and smaller lots, which meant farms which are simply not viable, which meant the wealthy, the aristocrats, could buy up the land, then have sort of mega farms, and then the otherwise landowners, or hitherto landowners, then became labourers, effectively working cheek to jowl alongside the slave labour that these bigger farms had. So that created some unrest. Now, in the 130s BC, the Gracchi brothers the tribunes of the people, tribunes of the plebs as they were called, who were themselves, by the way, aristocrats. They wanted to do some land reforms and effectively take land away from the Roman satellites in the Italian peninsula, take land away from them and declare it as public land and give it to Roman citizens. And this was cut across other areas and concerns. For example, in order to serve in the army, you had to have a certain property qualification. The numbers were declining there. There was big demand on the army at that point, but numbers were declining. And if people had smaller plots of land where they couldn't really make a living out of it, they were saying, well, why should I have to give up my life for the army as well? So there are other issues, and people weren't turning up for the census, and so there were some concerns there. Now, the Gracchi brothers, or the Tiberius Gracchi, the older one, wanted to change the voting for a number of committees in the Senate and a number of areas of the wider body politic to secret ballot. This outraged the moneyed classes because it meant they couldn't bribe politicians, or if they did bribe them, they had no way of knowing whether the politician had voted as they were required to do. Given that, then fewer people were willing to pay bribes unless they knew and could control or see the result and the outcome for the money they'd spent. So there was a certain confusion there. Similarly, the use of the tribunes of the people, to the extent that the Gracchi brothers did, interfering with what typically would have been the domain of the Senate, tended to undermine the Senate and create confusion as to where the centres of power lay and who had a veto over who and who could influence what. So it rather changed things in Rome from what had been just particularly the Senate really making the rules and voting into moving it into another sphere. And I think this eroded the Senate's authority. And the next thing was the Gracchi brothers had created a certain amount of animus against them in the wider political scene, and they were murdered and their supporters were beaten to death. This also opened the door to the idea of if someone doesn't agree with you, you just fucking kill them. And that wasn't really a good thing to have going around. Now, because a lot of the power elites were glad to be rid of the Gracchi brothers, they didn't really do much about that. It was taken as a tacit acceptance that the really people or folks that don't go along with things as they should be, must be murdered or can be murdered, and there won't really be the sort of repercussions you would expect or anticipate. So there's political confusion and I think uncertainty, and also an erosion of the sovereign authority of the Senate at this point. Now, just as that uncertainty's there, and again, Rome hasn't been invaded or hasn't been under threat of invasion really since the Second Punic War. So we're talking 100 years previous. Now, there's two tribes, the Cimbri or Cimbri, sometimes it's pronounced, the Cimbri and the Teutons, which are they come from Central Eastern, Northeastern Europe, and they're moving through Europe. They've had a few bad harvests in a row. They're on the move, and for somewhat practical reasons, I guess. And they're moving around in large numbers, many hundreds of thousands, and they're coming through Europe or Germany, what today would be Germany and Austria, and the local German tribes, they say, hey, look, you don't want to stay here. We haven't got that much. Where you want to go is that glittering golden city. The streets are paved with gold. Milk and honey just rain out of the sky. That's where you guys want to go. So, of course, they start heading towards Rome and come into northern Italy. The Senate vacillated. For the Roman Senate was usually quite resolute, and they had been, say, in the Punic Wars and the more recent wars around Macedon and these sorts of things. They'd been quite resolute in making the decision to go to war and having sort of clear war aims and goals that they were pursuing. They seemed to dither a lot over what do we do about the Cimbri and the Teuton. They didn't know. There's a lot of hand-wringing and vacillating and endless debates. And this went down like a lead balloon with the Roman public. Why are these guys screwing around when there's hard decisions to be made? So ultimately they sent a couple of armies up to stop the Cimbri and the Teuton. Both of these armies were defeated. And so it was turning into blind panic around, not only in Rome, but through the Italian peninsula, and everyone was getting understandably getting pretty worked up. The Cimbri and the Teuton were known for their brutality, so nobody wanted that sort of aggravation. So they settled on a strong man, a consul. And remember, there are 2 consuls elected every year. A consul, Gaius Marius, and he's quite a competent general, and of course part of the political elite as well. And he takes an army up to up to northern Italy, and follows these. I can't remember if it's the Cimbri or the Teuton, or whichever one came first. So meets them at a place called Acquisexti, which is today in southeast France, just near the French-Italian border, and delivers a crushing defeat to these guys, and then backs up for a second and indeed a third victory over the ensuing weeks. So that threat of the Cimbri and the Teuton is well and truly neutralised. Now, Marius, of course, is considered to be a hero, justifiably so, by the way. He's considered to be a hero. He's got a loyal army, and he's got the Roman and Italian public that sees him as a hero and a saviour. And so the Senate, unwisely, I think, and just to carry the popularity, give Marius another consulship, and he does some reorganisation, quite important, by the way, the Marian reforms, as they're called, to the armed services, and the sort of qualifications needed to serve in the army, and would the soldiers be given farms at the end of their services, if you like, the equivalent of a pension. And so he was quite instrumental in restructuring the Roman army at this point. Now, partly to curry favour, and partly because there was a lot of political confusion at the time, they gave Marius multiple consulships, 7 in all, and that turned Marius into sort of a quasi-dictator in a way. And again, he had a loyal army following him. So this further eroded the power and the sovereignty of the Senate. They existed now at the goodwill of Marius. Now, Marius had a lieutenant who'd been involved in these battles with the Cimbri and the Teuton, called Cornelius Sulla. And so in order to protect itself, the Senate would then go from one strong man to the next. So we'll have this guy with his army protect us against that guy with his army, and that'll protect democracy in the Senate. But of course it doesn't do that. The Senate further erodes its sovereignty if it becomes nothing more than a little flunky chasing the strong man general with an army, saying, please protect us. And so it descended, and it was a civil war, for goodness sakes. It descended into chaos. Now, it was these building blocks of chaos, loss of sovereignty, military strong man, all that sort of stuff, that really laid wide open the doors for somebody like a Julius Caesar to come along. All the institutions had broken down. Nobody trusted or believed in anything anymore. The Senate had minimal control, if any. Generals were rampaging the length and breadth of Italy, and again, the civil war and so on. So now, Julius Caesar had been in Gaul for really just the tail end of that first phase of the civil war was going on, and he'd conquered Gaul and spent 10 years doing so. And so he had a very loyal army. The Senate was attempting to reassert itself by now, and it was concerned, justifiably by the way, was concerned about the sort of following and power that Julius Caesar had acquired, fearing that yet another strong man was going to come along and threaten the Republic. Now, the Republic was already under threat, and the Senate had already lost its authority, or much of it, and various vested interests, some which were against Julius Caesar, were really wanted just to nobble him, to get him out of the way from the political scene at the time. So it wasn't just an issue of restoring democracy or the sovereignty of the Senate. It was far more political, many intrigues and sinister games going on there. So Caesar in 49 BC crosses the Rubicon, which is the river which demarcated sort of the area that he nominally had control of, which is already really the end of the Republic, when you've got the Roman provinces carved up like that between what was referred to as the Triumvirate. What was it initially? I think Caesar, Lepidus, and Crassus. Crassus had died in 53 BC in Parthia. But the issue here was that the Senate had lost its sovereignty, and really to re-establish central control, either the Senate had to take back control, which means it had to find a champion who was prepared to defeat all the other participants in the civil war, and then graciously hand back power to the Senate. So they had to find a general who not only was competent and could win, but perceived themselves as a servant of the people, or a servant of the Senate. Now, there's not many. That was the way things were done in ancient Rome, but not anymore. Now, Caesar eventually won the civil war, so then the Senate decided, well, if we assassinate, given everything's calmed down, if we assassinate Caesar, then the Senate will take control. But it didn't work out that way, and the civil wars continued. For another 44, another 15 plus years, the civil war continued till eventually the politician Octavian, with his very competent general Marcus Agrippa, were able to defeat all the other comers, including Mark Antony, and take control of the entire Roman Empire and set up the Principate, which means that the Senate was already had lost all of its, well, not all of its authority. It was just really administrative bureaucracy rather than a decision-making body, and decisions were made at the level of the emperor and his advisors. How do we relate to that today? How can we see that? Well, there are parallels, of course, but what the globalists have done is that they've eradicated all the institutions that kept the society going, in my view. And these institutions, once removed, and they have been, I mean, the democracy and the right of the people to choose their government, independence of the courts, sovereign borders, the whole thing goes on. Right? So by eradicating or fatally undermining all of that, they've created those conditions for a strong man to come along. Now, to operate within because the Constitution's been so subverted, is it possible to restore the sovereignty of the people through the Constitution, or must it be equally subverted in order to reverse all the damage done? I don't think it needs complete subversion, but there needs to be a very determined effort to root out all of the globalists and the deep state operatives and the flunkies, root them all out, and to take steps to ensure that elections are, that the probity of elections is completely above board, and the independence of the courts, absolutely paramount, the independence of the courts, and the independence of the political system outside of lobbyists and all sorts of things like that. Now, it can be done, but there needs to be a huge amount of concerted effort and determination to do it, but it can be done. Would that person need to be a Caesar? I don't think so. I think it can be done pretty much within the Constitution, but it just needs an all-out commitment. If we look at, say, for example, Donald Trump's first term, the globalists were able to wrong-foot him and run rings around him for so much of his administration, and he seemed to just flounder and be almost powerless to respond, and the response was ineffectual. The attacks against him were done with coordinated and grim determination, indeed as they are now through the fucking courts. So Trump in his next term, and I hope there is one, has to look at this as you've got to hit it hard and get the job done, and return the sovereignty of Western nations, or the United States in this case, return sovereignty back to the people, and that if that can be achieved, then I think a lot of the other problems will go away. You've been a Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.